Hey, welcome to another episode of Inspirational Focus, in which Deacon Terry Acox will be discussing another part of the sacraments, Holy Communion. So stay tuned. Hey, welcome back to another edition of Inspirational Focus with Deacon Terry Acox. Terry has started lessons, if you want to call it that, inspirational thoughts about the different sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church. And he has previously talked about baptism and confirmation. And today he's going to give us an overview of Holy Communion, or the Eucharist. So welcome back, Terry.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And it's my understanding that you've done a lot of different pieces of research about the Eucharist and Holy Communion. So just what is Holy Communion?
Okay, Holy Communion is the third of the three sacraments of initiation. The first being baptism, and another being confirmation. So this is the third of the three sacraments of initiation. And it was, the term Eucharist means thanksgiving in Greek. It comes from a Greek word meaning thanksgiving. And it was instituted at the Last Supper by Jesus Christ on Holy Thursday.
Now, the Last Supper is where the 12 apostles and he broke bread, if you want to call it that.
They broke bread. They were preparing for the Passover meal.
Oh, okay. And so Passover meal, so they had bread and they had wine.
They had bread, and those are the main sacraments, parts of the sacrament of Eucharist.
Oh, okay.
But they probably had other parts of the meal too.
Sure.
Because the Passover for the ancient Jewish people included lamb and other.
I see. So the Passover with the since Christ was really a Jewish.
All the apostles in Christ were all Jewish faithful.
Oh, okay. All right. So they were Jewish, and they were celebrating or remembering Passover.
Okay, for the ancient Jewish people, the Passover reminds them, or brings into the reality of the Exodus from Egypt when they were slaves in Egypt. And the Passover is where God sent the angel of death to kill the firstborn of all the households.
Because the Ramses, I guess, was the Pharaoh. He would not release Moses and the
Jewish people.
I see.
So what God was doing, he threatened to kill the entire, or not the entire, but the firstborn of every Jewish household. And to escape from that, what the Jewish families had to do was kill a lamb without blemish and take the blood of the lamb and sprinkle it over the lintels and doorposts of their homes.
I see.
That way the angel of death would pass over those houses and not kill the firstborn of that household.
I see. And it's my understanding that's when the Pharaoh decided to let Moses go.
At that point in time, after that, they let the Jewish people leave.
So every year then, they celebrated the Passover.
Right. They had to celebrate the Passover in a certain way. For example, they had to be dressed ready to leave.
Oh.
All right. This was basically to make the Passover real at every year when they celebrated it.
Oh, okay. All right. And so that's what the apostles, and as you said, they were celebrating the Passover, the Thursday, what we call Holy Thursday. And so they were partaking in the bread and wine and all the different food that is accompanied.
Right.
Huh, that's interesting.
Okay. And it was at the Passover meal that Christ instituted the Eucharist. And he actually spoke the words that we now use for consecration, that the priest uses for the consecration of the bread and the wine.
I see.
At that time.
I see. And those words, so he knew, Jesus Christ knew that this was going to be his last Thursday on earth.
Yes.
And that he also probably knew that later on the evening and tomorrow was going to be his death.
He knew what was going to happen. He knew all about his passion and death. And then throughout the Bible, throughout the Gospels, he tried to tell his apostles this, but they were, I don't know if you'd call it, somewhat perhaps reluctant to believe it. I don't know.
Well, it's sort of, if I came up to you, Terry, and say, today's my last day, you're going to look at me going,
he looks healthy.
Yeah, and so I can sort of understand, that that the apostles didn't put as much energy. First of all, they didn't want to lose him.
Right.
He was their leader.
True. He had led the apostles for 3 years throughout the lower part of Galilee, from Jerusalem up through to Bethlehem, and the other towns throughout Galilee. So he had been preaching all the time and performing miracles, and then on his last trip to Jerusalem, it was then that they had the Last Supper.
I see.
In celebration of the Passover.
Okay, but he knew it was something more.
He knew it was something more. Yes, like I said, his apostles weren't quick to accept the idea of him being crucified.
Yeah. Well, I certainly understand that. So, in the meal, sometime during the meal is when he drew all of his apostles together and started talking about the Eucharist and started talking about the...
Right. During the meal, he spoke the words of consecration. At the beginning, he took the bread and said, "Take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body, which will be given up for you." So those are the words of consecration.
I see.
Over what we now use as a wheat wafer, if you will.
Right. Unleavened bread.
Unleavened bread.
Yeah.
That we now use, the wheaten wafer. Those are the words of consecration that turn that wheat wafer into the body of Christ.
Okay. Right.
It doesn't physically change.
No.
But our belief is that once these words are spoken, then that is the body of Christ.
I see. And can anyone do this? Can anyone take some bread and say those words?
No, it has to be a priest or a bishop.
Oh, okay.
They are the only ones who have the authority of the church to speak these words of consecration, which perform this.
Oh, okay.
They call it transubstantiation.
Oh, okay. And that's where it physically stays the same, but spiritually
it becomes into the body of Christ.
Right. Okay.
And that is the actual belief of the church.
Oh, okay.
And then the same words are spoken over the chalice, or similar words are spoken over the chalice of wine. The words are, in this case, are, "Take this, all of you, and drink from it. For this is the chalice of my blood, the blood of the new and eternal covenant, which will be poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in memory of me." So
those words, we had the bread consecrated, and then we had the wine.
Consecrated with these words, and that, again, through this transubstantiation, turns the wine into the blood of Christ. Because if you remember in the Gospel, especially in the Gospel of John, he goes through a fairly long narrative of what's going to happen to him. And he says to the Jewish people prior to that unless you eat my bread or eat my body and drink my blood, you will not have everlasting life.
Okay.
So this
sets the stage.
This sets the stage for the sacrament of Holy Eucharist.
And which is celebrated throughout the world.
Which is celebrated in every Mass throughout the world.
You know, Deacon Terry, it's rather interesting. My wife and I have had the opportunity to travel, and she's been out of the country. And it is interesting that whenever we attend a Catholic ceremony, whether it's here or across the world, they always have the three important parts of each Mass, and it's celebrated, you know, the readings, the consecration, and then the distribution
of the Eucharist.
And it's interesting that the priests in their own language, or in Latin, or in English, say the same words, consecration.
The Mass is basically the same all throughout the world. Now, there are different prayers that can be used. For example, there are several Eucharistic prayers that can be used for various occasions.
I see.
There are 4 that are listed primarily in the Roman Missal, but there are several others. There's a Mass of Reparation that has different words, but these same words of consecration are always spoken.
I see. When I was growing up, it was interesting. I was considered the hosts. The communion, Holy Communion, was of such nature that only the priest could touch them. And through the ecumenical council, it said that those that prepare in their hearts and in their mind can also distribute the communion.
Right. So we've had over the last, since the Second Vatican Council, have let lay people distribute communion, and it's primarily for a pastoral reason of somewhat speeding up the process.
Sure.
Because if you're in a very large parish,
yes,
and you only have one priest,
right,
it could take a long time to distribute communion to all of the people.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But there is a training that these people have to go through. It's more of it's a spiritual training, actually, not a physical training.
Okay.
They're called extraordinary ministers, because the ordinary minister of the Eucharist is the bishop, the priest, or the deacon. Those are the 3 ordained clergy who can distribute the Eucharist to the
consecrate
people.
And then distribute. Yes.
No, the deacon cannot consecrate.
Right. Okay. Yes, you're right. You're right. Right.
But they can distribute under ordinary means.
Okay.
All right. A lay person is called an extraordinary minister. That is out of the ordinary.
Oh, okay.
Because again, only the priest, deacon, and bishop are the ordinary ministers. The lay people are out of the ordinary ministers. Okay. So they can distribute the Holy Communion following that spiritual training and a blessing given to them by the priest.
Oh, okay. All right. So when you do go to Mass and you have a number of individuals distributing communion and drinking of the wine, etc., they are extraordinary.
They are extraordinary ministers, generally. Okay.
And what about, I know that my wife, as well as many others, take communion to the sick and the homebound.
Yes, that is, if you will, a primary duty of the extraordinary minister, because there are only so many priests, and even in parishes like we have in the Portsmouth area, there are probably 1,800 people or families that are Catholic in the Portsmouth area. If these people get sick, then the priest cannot possibly get to all of them to give them communion on any kind of regular basis.
I see.
So now we have the extraordinary ministers who can take Holy Communion in the form of the body of Christ to these Eucharistic men, to the homebound and to those in the hospitals and nursing homes.
That's interesting. Now, you were saying that at the Last Supper, that was the first Eucharistic Mass, if you want to call it that.
If you want to, yes.
I'm sort of stretching the words. So after Christ was killed, crucified, etc., did they begin doing the consecration then, or? I know that
scriptures don't really tell us what exactly happened after that.
Okay.
But we have information, like St. Paul, for example, in one of his letters to the Corinthians, gives an account of the consecration in one of the letters to the Corinthians, and then later in that same letter, he tells of a mass, if you will, that went on that happened at that time. And this is approximately 25 or 30 years after the death of Christ.
I see. Hey, and then also Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John spoke extensively through the Gospels, especially during the Last Supper and things of that nature, and also emphasized what Christ did. Is that correct?
Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, gave a pretty detailed account of the Last Supper.
Okay.
And then after the death and resurrection of Christ, their stories basically end at that point. Now, in John's Gospel, there is not an account of the Last Supper.
Oh, okay.
But there is a lengthy discourse called the Bread of Life discourse.
I see.
Which is probably 2 or 3 chapters in that Gospel that tells about Christ, death and resurrection, and that's where he speaks the words, if you do not eat of my body, you do not have everlasting life, and so forth.
Well, that sort of explains a couple of things. There's a number of different religions that don't know if we Catholics read much from the Bible, but we do.
Right.
We have an Old Testament, a New Testament, and then one of the Gospel, a reading from each of the 3. And that sort of explains something. Every 3 years, the church each year uses the readings of Luke, and then the readings of Matthew, and then the readings of Mark.
Right. And
then during special ceremonies or special circumstances, they use readings of John.
Yes. Like I said, the readings that we hear in Mass are on a 3-year schedule. Matthew is year A, Mark is year B, Luke is year C, and then John is used a lot during Advent and Lent.
I see.
Plus, there are other times when it's done, depending on what the particular day might be that we're celebrating. For example, can't think of
But there have been those occasions where it's very important that the populace, the lay people, best understand, and John sort of puts it in perspective, in his writings.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's rather interesting. I didn't know that all three of the Gospels ended, after.
Shortly after the Last Supper. Some go into a little bit of detail on the crucifixion. Mark doesn't go into a lot of detail on the crucifixion, but Matthew and Luke give some detail. And again, like I said, John does not have an account of the Last Supper.
Does John go into the Pentecost?
No, that happens afterwards. That happens in the book of Acts.
Oh, okay. All right. So the Gospels end, and then the book of Acts.
The book of Acts gives an account of the early church.
I see.
How it grew from simply the apostles and the disciples, other followers, to encompass now, 1 point something odd billion people.
Yeah. A few plus or minus, so that's rather interesting. And then with the Holy Communion, once it's consecrated, it's recommended that each Catholic receive communion.
Yes.
For sure on Sunday, but throughout
every Catholic should receive communion at least on a weekly basis, okay? But there are some conditions, if you will.
Okay.
You have to be in the proper attitude, if you will, to receive it.
Sure.
For example, you cannot receive communion if you have a mortal sin on your soul.
Okay.
You've committed an act of adultery, perhaps.
Okay.
Until you go to confession, then you should not receive communion.
I see.
Because this acts somewhat as a profanation of the Eucharist, of the body and blood of Christ that you receive when you have a mortal sin on your soul.
I see.
Now, some of the everyday sins, if you will, that we commit.
Yeah, we call them venial sins.
Venial sins, like uttering a curse word out of frustration or something like that. These types of things are taken care of during the Mass when we recite the Confiteor.
Oh, okay.
That prepares us to put us in the proper frame of mind to receive the Eucharist. Because those little things that we do out of frustration or without thinking, like, if we're going into a store and we let the door slam in front of a little old lady behind us, that takes care of those types of things.
I understand, and I promise you I would never do that again. Well, even in driving, it is interesting how frustrated many people do get, so it's a good example, what you're saying.
So, first of all, you have to be in the proper frame of mind.
Okay.
All right. So once you've recited the Confiteor to take care of the little things, if you will, then you do not have a mortal sin on your soul, then you can receive communion.
Okay.
And actually, the Church requires that you receive communion at least once a year, preferably during the Easter cycle. That is, between Ash Wednesday and throughout the Easter season, which is approximately 8 weeks after Easter.
Right.
And so
it's interesting. 8 weeks after Easter
is Pentecost.
Is Pentecost.
Yes. All right. So once we've received communion, you can receive the body of Christ in two different ways. You can either hold out your hands and then take it and consume it immediately, or you can stick out your tongue and the priest or the minister will lay it on your tongue. All right, then you have the option also, if you wish, to receive the blood of Christ,
which is the consecrated wine. Okay.
All right, not everybody does that.
I understand.
For a variety of reasons. For example, if you've got a cold, perhaps you may not want to receive the consecrated blood, and then
sure,
because we wipe the chalice off after somebody receives, but that is not a sanitary purification, if you will.
I understand.
All right, the purpose of wiping the cup is to prevent a drop of the sacred blood from dropping onto the floor.
I see. I see. Okay. That makes sense. And I know that receiving both, what we call both species.
Both species.
It's bread, wine. When extraordinary communicants, that ministers that go and deliver communion, do they also take wine?
No, they only take the
bread,
the body of Christ.
Oh, okay.
The reason being is primarily it's practical.
Yeah. That makes
you're
sense.
more likely to spill a liquid than you are to.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So, and there's a little pamphlet that they take with them also. It's a little bit of a ceremony that they go through prior to distributing the Eucharist to the homebound and the sick.
So if someone wishes to be an extraordinary minister, what do they do? What do you suggest? If someone came up to you and said, "Hey, I want to be an extraordinary minister."
The first thing, well, it depends on really who's in charge of training these people.
I see.
Okay, if it were my job to train extraordinary ministers, I would tell that person, if you want to do it immediately, we can set up something, put an announcement in the church bulletin, or perhaps other things. But anyway, communicate to the rest of the population of the parish that we're going to have a training session for for extraordinary ministers in the next 2 months or something of that nature. Then we can go get our spiritual training taken care of, and then at that point, once the spiritual training is done, there will be a ceremony where the priest will bless them.
I see.
They can just start distributing.
Oh, okay.
Just get on the schedule to start distributing the Eucharist.
Would you say that, again, Scioto County has 6 different churches? 7 different Catholic churches, etc. Are there a lot of volunteers, or?
It depends on the number of people. Some parishes have a lot of volunteers, some have very few.
Okay.
One parish that I'm familiar with has only 2 Eucharist or extraordinary ministers, and if they're not happen to be at church at that particular time, then they do not distribute
the wine?
The wine.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Oh, that makes sense. Well, we only have about a minute left. What would you like to leave the audience with about Holy Communion? And it's just not bread, but also bread and wine.
Yeah, the Holy Communion, the Eucharist, is the source and summit of our faith. Everything else that the church does points toward the body and blood of Christ.
I see.
That is the most important, the holiest sacrament that we have.
Okay.
And I, for one, think it is that, and I participate, every chance I get.
Okay.
You can attend daily Mass,
sure,
and weekend Mass, and whenever possible, you should partake of the Holy Communion.
Okay, all right. And one other question: can anyone receive communion?
No, only baptized Catholics can receive communion in the church.
Okay, and so they have to go through that baptism, confirmation?
Not necessarily confirmation, because generally a first communicant, when you receive the first time, you're younger, second grade age, and you haven't gone through confirmation yet. So confirmation is not necessary to receive communion.
Okay.
But the reason that they want baptized Catholics to do that is the basic belief that that is the body and blood of Christ. Not everybody believes that. A lot of the Protestant faiths do not believe that that is truly the body and blood of Christ. They believe that it merely represents the body and blood of Christ. So, and it's that belief.
That's interesting. Well, Terry, I learned a lot, and I thank you. I hope that we continue next month with another sacrament. Learned a lot. So on behalf of Deacon Terry Acox, I'm Patrick Dengel. Thank you for listening and viewing Inspirational Focus.